Episode 32, interview with film composer Brian Christopherson of Legend Point Media.
Welcome to the Visionary Variety Podcast, where we cover all kinds of cool stuff like photo, video, film, books, and technology. So switch on your brain and enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. We've got a fun one today. We're going to be interviewing our friend, Brian Christopherson of Legend Point Media. Well, with us today, we've got Nate Gunn, the guy you want in your MySpace top 8.
Yeah.
And
in a world with no good music, one man, one keyboard will change everything.
Brian Christopherson.
Or will he?
Dun, dun, dun. And myself, Daniel Grove, the guy for whom no podcast is too boring to listen to. Well, welcome back to the podcast. We've got with us a special guest, Brian Christopherson. Brian, tell us where you're from and what you do.
Well, I was born a long ways away from Texas. I'm originally from the Pacific Northwest, from the Portland, Oregon area. And about 16 years ago, moved down here to San Antonio because God had some pretty cool things lined up for me to do down here. So I thought I'd take advantage of that.
Like meet me.
Actually going to Nate's old church. That was actually what brought me to San Antonio. Crazy stuff.
And then you wound up at the church that I ended up going to. So small world.
Well, my goal is to make everybody's world as microscopic as possible.
Thanks. All right, cool. Well, we're going to be talking about Brian's music company that he has. He makes all kinds of awesome music for various things. So let's get started. Brian, why don't you tell us exactly what do you do?
Well, since in the context of being a film composer, I mean, I've got a pretty varied music background, right? So I've been in various bands, been on lots of different worship teams for church groups, done a lot of led youth music teams, and then been in a lot of youth choirs and done all that stuff when I was a teenager. But most recently just got into composing original music for independent film and television.
That's really cool. How'd you get into that?
About 5 or 6 years ago, our church that I was going to ended up sharing the sanctuary of another church, and so they would meet on Sundays and we would meet on Saturdays. Well, anyway, there was a guy that was actually living in the upstairs of the main sanctuary, which actually was a gym, and there was a bunch of rooms up there with showers and all that sort of stuff. Well, anyway, this guy up there was living there with his family. And anyway, he approached me one day and said, "Hey, man, I really, I was checking out your guys' service that you were having on Saturday night. Really enjoyed the way you played keyboards, and was wondering if you wrote any of your own stuff." I was like, "Well, I've been in bands, and I can write a guitar lick or come up with keyboard parts, and that sort of stuff. So I've kind of written some of my own stuff in that regards." He's like, "Well, have you ever really considered writing original music for film?" And I'm like, "Not in my wildest dreams I've ever thought I would actually do something like that." I mean, I've been a fan of film music for almost my entire life. I still remember to this day, seeing Star Wars episode 4 in the theater on opening night in 1977. That's how old I am. I am ancient. I babysat Moses.
You were alive back then?
Exactly. Yeah. It was crazy. We had steam powered cars. No, it wasn't that long ago. But anyway, my dad took me to see Star Wars on opening night, May 4th, 1977 in
the original May 4th.
Yeah, it was a pretty big deal. And I remember walking out of that just absolutely fascinated by two things. Number one, X-Wing fighters and music.
Yes.
I mean, look at the design of the X-Wing fighter, I think, is the most iconic, coolest design. All ship design has gone downhill from that. That is the penultimate of spaceship design, right? I mean, even the wings split. I mean, it's just like,
so awesome.
Yeah, God created the X-Wing. George Lucas just took credit for it.
Inspired. Holy Spirit inspired.
Right. But it was but the other thing though that really caught my attention was John Williams' music. The big orchestral, score. And I got lucky in that my parents are fans of classical music. So I grew up listening to a lot of Mozart and a lot of Beethoven and, a lot of guys out of the Baroque, Mendelssohn and Handel, those guys. And so I kind of had already, even at that young age, I think I was like 6, something like that. My ear had already been kind of trained to kind of listen and pay attention to this kind of music. But John Williams just took it to a whole nother level, right? And it really, even at 6 years old, music in film or really identifying music as that thing that makes you feel something in the movie. It just really resonated with me, but it was just something that I enjoyed. So I grew up listening to classical music. Never learned how to play any of it, but I really enjoyed it.
Much.
Yeah,
it's not that fun.
Right. Yeah. So it was really strange because I never took any piano lessons or anything like that growing up. My grades never let me have that privilege. That was the thing. Well, if you get enabled, we'll give you piano lessons, and I come home with a C, and I'm like, well, so much for that.
Oh, shucks.
Yeah, it was terrible. I didn't actually learn how to play anything until after high school. But the appreciation though for what music brings to a film has always kind of been there. So when Leroy, this Christian filmmaker, when he said, well, would you like an opportunity to write some original music for a film I'm making? I'm like, I had to kind of pinch myself. I'm like, is that a real question? Are you?
That's like the dream. A musician always wishes some mysterious guy would come up to him after them playing a gig and say, "Hey, I got a job for you."
I know, right?
It's like a movie.
It's this guy. At first it's like, yeah, stranger danger, But it's a guy that I had seen, around for the several months, and I knew he was legit. I never knew what he did, but it was obvious that he was an accepted part of that particular church body that was hosting us. So come to find out, in one of the rooms I'd never been in was actually his editing room.
Nice.
That he was editing the movie he was working on at that particular time. It was a movie called Heartset. And so when I walked in there and he has his editor there putting it all together on his iMac with Apple, I was just like, holy smokes, this is real. So I didn't get to work on that particular project because he had already had everything lined up for that, but he was thinking about his future projects down the road. And so that's just kind of the mere fact that he asked me if I was willing to do that just kind of put all of this in motion.
So you were talking about a project you worked on in the past. You have anything more recent that you've been working on?
Yeah, actually right now, I'm not actively actually creating music for a project right now because it's still in pre-production, but I'm working with a local company here in New Braunfels, NSM Productions, and they are currently filming a TV pilot. And
cool.
it's going to be called Recreation, like Wreck-It Ralph with a W, but it's called Recreation. Basically, it's a show about a couple of Texas game wardens. It's kind of the show, after reading the pilot script, it's kind of like Lethal Weapon meets Dumb and Dumber.
Oh, fun!
It's kind of an oddball show. There's a dream sequence where one of the main characters, the goofier of the main two characters, actually dreams he's back in the Old West. Anyway, so it's like these Texas game wardens. They run across a drug cartel and mayhem ensues. Kind of a thing. So,
where are they filming that?
They're filming all over South Texas, mostly cool. Here in the New Braunfels, San Antonio area. But it is a show based in Texas, so it's not like there's going to be a lot of. Yeah. They're not going to Tatooine, right? They're
I've always wondered. Like, I've never seen anything being filmed in this area, but I'm sure there's got to have been.
There's most of the Alamo movies that you've ever seen in the theater or on TV, they were filmed here. Surprisingly enough. Like the big John Wayne one that was done back in the 60s or whatever that was. And then the more recent one with like Billy Bob Thornton and all those guys, that was actually filmed here in San Antonio. There was a TV show on ABC that was on a couple of years ago. It was the worst named TV show ever. Killer Women.
Ooh.
Killer Women.
Killer Women.
Killer Women.
Like
I know.
movie.
It sounds like Roger Corman Presents. It's terrible. But
Sharknado prequel.
Oh, I know. The Sharknado was like, yeah, we can do better than that. But surprise. So it was a show about this Texas Ranger woman. It was actually played by the chick who was the blonde haired chick on Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I don't remember her name, but she was this.
I like her, but I can't stand her laugh.
Yeah, she was this Texas Ranger, and I didn't watch the pilot because I was just so not interested because the name was so bad. But somebody at work told me that the show was really good, so I caught the second episode, and it was all right, but it held my interest enough that I watched the third, and by the fourth episode, it was a fantastic show. Extremely well written, well acted, filmed right here in San Antonio and Bernie.
Very cool.
Yeah, downtown San Antonio was, in half the shots in every episode, just about. So it was, and unfortunately, it became a really, really good show. And by the season finale, I was completely hooked because it was the worst. Like I said, it was the worst name because the storyline really kind of went somewhere else. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details because the show's been canceled, long since canceled, but it was a good show and it was right here in San Antonio.
Did you know there was an episode of Revolution recorded in New Braunfels? Did you ever watch Revolution?
Overall, I liked it. I thought some of the episodes were not as well done as others, but overall, I liked the show. And I did hear that part of it was filmed here in Texas and I wondered about that because you watch that show, it's like, those look like Texas shrubs.
They have some great locations in that show.
Yeah, they do.
I don't blame them. The place that they used was the old mill by the Faust Bridge over on the river in New Braunfels. And I actually got to shoot. I had permission from the owner at the time to shoot at that same location.
Oh, nice.
And he told me that. And he's like, I asked him, has any photographer ever used this place? Anyone ever done like a music video? Because this is like the coolest place for this industrial look. He's like, oh yeah, some TV show, Revolution. I was like, oh my gosh, what? I'm like watching that show right now.
Yeah, I know the Green really Dance Hall has been in a few movies.
Yeah. Michael.
Yeah, Michael. There's that's probably the most well known one.
There's a scene in Legally Blonde that was shot downtown. The pageant in the movie is on the Riverwalk.
Was that Legally Blonde or was that Miss Congeniality?
Oh shoot, Miss Congeniality.
Yeah, it was Miss Congeniality with William Shatner. Yeah.
That, yes.
William Shatner in front of the Alamo is like, that's America right there.
So great. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Oh, and I have a friend we're hopefully going to have her on the podcast soon. She's a writer, director, kind of aficionado, and also an actor. And she was an extra in Battle Angel Alita. And that was, they filmed some of those shots in Austin.
That's cool. I didn't know that. That's
super cool. Yeah. That's like a hard sci-fi.
Yeah.
Well, not hard sci-fi, but
still has a lot of post-production yet to do. So much CGI in that movie. Yeah. Looks good,
too much, I think. Yeah. That'll be, maybe we'll do an episode on that movie. That'll be a fun one to review. Yeah, so you're working on, you're going to be working on this TV show that's still being produced and the pilot's being made, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they're still filming it, so they're still in production. The lead, one of the main actor, who's also an executive producer, he decided to get married in the middle of all this, so we've been on like a month and a half hiatus. But filming picks back up, I think, here in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully they'll get it all the principal photography done. I know the Old West scene, the rough cut of that is done. That might be the first scene that I'm getting here in the next week or so, where I can actually really start.
Get your spaghetti Western whistles ready.
Well, I know, right?
That dovetails perfectly into my next question was, what is this process like? Let's say we're on the next step. What is the next step, and how do the directors give you information as to what to make for the music? Like, how does that whole thing pan out, and how does that work?
Generally, the process is that the director and I will have a meeting at Starbucks, or we'll meet at my place or his place or whatever's comfortable. And the first meeting is usually just him pitching the idea of what the story is, and just seeing if I would be interested in being involved in it. Obviously, there's going to be some, the media industry can be pretty carnal, to say the least. So there's a few genres of entertainment that I'm not going to be a part of, by choice. So we kind of have that initial meeting to just kind of see, hey, does this sound interesting to you? Do you want to be a part of this? Et cetera, et cetera. And if the answer is yes, if it captures my interest, then we might just kick around some ideas about how much music is wanted, or just maybe some big concepts of what kind of music do you want? Do you want it orchestral? Do you want it small? Sometimes we don't even have those conversations about the specific kind of music. more often than not, the directors that I've worked with so far really have been kind of a blank slate in terms of the music, which,
Cool.
it is and it isn't. Because my job as a composer, my primary job is to help the director tell his story. So I need to map to his or her vision.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to be really careful that I don't let my own wants and creative preferences and that sort of thing kind of color that.
Yeah.
Because then ultimately that actually makes I detract from the story, and the end result of the audience. The audience gets a movie that isn't as good as what it should have been, right?
Yeah. And it's not what the director envisioned.
Right. Because it just, the director doesn't envision it. And also, I'm trying to build a business here, and business is built on repeat business, right? So I want directors, to have this impression that, well, if they're going to work with Brian Christopherson and the Legend Point Media team, that it's a good experience and they get exactly what they're looking for, or at even better, giving them exactly what they're wanting and exceeding that expectation, right? So that's kind of my goal from a business point of view. So that business philosophy kind of forces me to make sure that I'm always mapping to what the director's going for. But anyway, so after we have that first meeting, we'll usually schedule a second meeting, but somewhere in there, they'll usually send me a script. And I think that's really, really important. So when I get a script in my hand, I can actually go through every scene, every bit of dialogue, every bit of action, every location, and kind of get a sense of the tone of the film or the TV show or whatever it is, right? Because the purpose of music and film is to provide the emotional context for the story, right? I've long believed that music is the only tangible form of emotion that's available to us. Because everything else, emotion is an expression of emotion, but music actually is emotion, right?
That's cool.
So, I mean, it's actually vibrating your eardrum. So, I mean, it's actually tangible, right? So I want to make sure that in reading the script, I get kind of a good sense of what the overall emotional tone of the film is going to be. So that's kind of where it starts, and then I'll kind of start jotting down ideas, and from there I have a second meeting with the director, and that's where we really start getting into the details of, well, I read the script, and here's kind of what I thought I was thinking of based upon the script, maybe, and plus whatever input you had in that first initial conversation, if any. And that's where we'll start talking about different instruments. Do we want an orchestra? Do we want a rock band? Do we want a ukulele, what
synthesizer,
right? Yeah. Well, no, that almost goes without saying, right? No,
That's in your contract.
I'm saying right here for all the world to hear on your podcast that I will not be playing any Keytars for less than a healthy sum of money. I will say at this point, I do have a price. I am a humble enough man to admit that I can be bought.
So humble.
But
we had a running joke through at least 2 churches worth of congregations and media teams.
Yeah, we're not measuring this in years. We're measuring this in the number of churches that Daniel and I have been involved in.
That I know of, 2 churches worth of inside jokes. Basically, just trying to jab and cajole him into playing a Keytar on the worship team. And it got even worse when someone would say, "Hey, play that Keytar sound." I love that. Nick.
Like, oh yeah, play that. It's like you do realize that Keytars actually don't make any sounds, but it's an image thing. So no, there's no Keytar sounds in my music tracks for the record. But
all right,
I know. Like I said, I have a price. If the price of playing a Keytar is my employment, then I am humble enough to do it, right? But it is not my go-to instrument. We'll put it that way. So, but in all seriousness, though, this is where we really start. At that point, when I've read the script, I've made some notes, we'll really start talking about what kind of instruments, what kind of sounds do we really want? But that's when we also start talking budget.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's workload.
That's well, there's multiple pieces when you're doing a budget for a movie, or there's obviously there's multiple line items that you got to think about, multiple departments, and audio in itself. Audio usually represents about 10% of the overall film or TV budget.
Really? That's all?
Right? Yeah, I know. I mean, that's an average, right? I mean, everything is negotiable, but generally speaking, it's about 10%. Big budget, it can get up to as much as 20%. So, but what's interesting is that the composer fee, it comprises about 70% of that budget. But within that 70%, the composer actually is responsible for not just writing the music, but also producing the final audio stems that go to the final dubbing stage. So a composer nowadays is a full-blown audio production, for lack of a better term. I mean, it's usually a whole bunch of people. It's a production company with recording studios and all that, or they've got the budget to contract the studio. They'll contract an orchestra. I mean, an orchestra can cost $1 million all by itself just to hire the orchestra. Wow. And then you got to record it in a place that can actually do a good recording.
Oh, got to rent that.
Yeah, you got
to mic it and tech it.
Yep, exactly. Oof. So you're going to spend, on a big budget film with an orchestra, you're probably going to spend $2-3 million on just on getting the orchestra stuff down, right? So,
is there any word on how much Hans Zimmer gets paid?
He's actually played that pretty close to the vest, and he's also divested. So looking at his tax records actually doesn't really give you a good picture, because he owns Remote Control Productions in Santa Monica, and he's got tons of people working for him in all areas. So it's a lot. I know that more than I'll ever make. But
hey, now don't sell yourself short.
He makes a ton of, he's got some talents and skills that, I mean, he has defined modern film music even more than John Williams has. I mean, John Williams really defined what film sounded like from the last couple of decades of the 20th century. But it's Hans Zimmer that's defined the sound of film music for the 21st century. That's, when you start talking about what's his rate, you really can't put a price tag on that. You're right. You don't put a cap on what's possible. All at the same time, I'm not anticipating that I don't have the gifts or Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, calls it the talent stack, where it's kind of the combination of skills and talents that a person has built up that makes them unique. And I don't have the talent stack that Hans Zimmer does. And I don't anticipate. That's not the direction that I really want to go. I mean, he's a really weird, kooky, artistic kind of personality, but that's what allows him to be that iconic genre game changer.
It got him really far.
Right, exactly. I mean,
it's carrying him. Yeah,
it really is. I mean, it's that word quirkiness in his person that's uniquely Hans Zimmer that has enabled him to dip into artistic areas that's allowed him to redefine film music for the 21st century. I don't have that level of quirkiness. So I don't anticipate ever being, the genre changing, Hollywood A-lister. I don't, that's not my path. And therefore I'm okay with not having the paycheck that entails. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to be successful. I believe that I am going to be successful. I absolutely believe that, not just because I have to believe that, but because I actually do believe it, or else I wouldn't be in this business. I think I do have a voice. I do think that God has kind of lined up things in my life that is kind of, my life is going, it has this trajectory for a reason. And that reason is not to be unemployed. So I know that, my faith is informing me that jobs are coming my way. The evidence is there that people like what they hear. And, it's just as I meet more and more people in the industry, more and more people are getting interested in getting me involved. So I know I'm on a successful path here.
Yeah.
And, someday, I very well could be, writing music for the London Symphony Orchestra, and we're recording in Abbey Road Studios. I mean, there's recording engineers here in San Antonio. I was talking to one that was thinking about recording our band, and he couldn't do it on the weekend that we wanted him to do it because he was going to Abbey Road Studios in London. So, so I know that these kinds of things are absolutely possible. It doesn't take a great deal of faith for me to be able to envision a really cool, successful future for what I've got in mind. But anyway, going back to your original question about the process, it's at this point where we really start kind of talking about the reality of, well, here's what kind of music that the movie needs, but what's our budget? Can we actually do that?
Yeah.
With certain things I can kind of fudge. I mean, virtual orchestras are becoming really, really powerful. So, I actually can produce a pretty realistic orchestral sound. But at the same time, the movie has to warrant it, right? So right now, for the last film I did, it was a film called The Bang Up Job. I got played at various film festivals around the country. It was about an hour long. Actually, they cut it down. Cool. It was about a 40-minute. It was considered a short, right? Mm-hmm. And as I was going through kind of what that would sound like, it sounded a little bit more like a TV show, like a Burn Notice or Chicago PD or something like that. It wasn't this big orchestral John Williams or Hans Zimmer or James Newton Howard kind of sound. It was something that was a lot more kind of based in rock and pop. And we still definitely use some strings in there. It's because the string section is kind of one of those instrument groups that fit almost any environment, right?
It's an organic sound.
Yeah, it's very
emotional,
right? I think somebody said a cello is like the closest thing to the human voice that they've been able to invent, something like that. But anyway, we mostly used synth sounds and electronic beats and some guitar and that sort of stuff to make the sound, because that's kind of what it needed. But we kind of figured it out at that first initial, postscript meeting, and then from there it's just launching into actually creating it.
Well, I really liked what you said a while back about music being kind of a pure form of emotion and communication.
Right.
I think it's really shocking when you're watching, say, Dark Knight or Interstellar or Inception, and you mute the music, or if you were able to just take out the music track, like how much of the epicness would be gone. It sucks
the life out of that, But, one of the things that I've learned in doing this, though, is sometimes silence is exactly what's called for.
Yeah. You can
and so a lot of times it's learning, and I know a lot of good composers, they talk about when not to write.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Letting, sometimes you need that silence. Sometimes it's all about the dynamics, right? And so as I'm going through the process of trying to figure out what I'm going to write for a particular sequence, before I even get into actually writing notes or playing things, I'll generally sketch out what I call an emotion timeline.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And where I'll kind of go through the scene. Now, generally by this time, the scenes are already cut. They might not be the final cut, but they're pretty close, right? So I've actually got something for my eyeballs to look at, because when you go from script to on screen, it's a really different experience. And a lot of times I find myself scratching out a lot of what I did in the script, because the way they filmed it, the cinematography, the way
it's different.
It's a lot different. Case in point. So when I was auditioning for the Bang Up Job, the director, we met at the Starbucks there on Walnut Street in New Braunfels. And he said, well, I've heard that you can write music, but I need you to write me something. So, you pitched a little bit of the movie to me. He says, well, I want you to write me a 1-minute opening sequence. And we talked a little bit about the main character. So he said, I want you to write 1 minute for this opening sequence, and I want you to include the main theme for the character in your 1 minute piece. I'm like, okay. So I went home and I wrote this piece of music that, I didn't have a script at that time because it was still just an audition, right? But we had talked enough about the movie and what was going on. I thought, okay, I have enough in my head that I can write something. So I wrote something, and the director ended up really liking it, and I obviously ended up getting the job. Well, when he liked it so much that he said, I'm just using this, just move on to the next scenes. And so he would email me low resolution cuts of the scenes as they were coming in, and I would fly them into my DAW, which I use Cubase, and started scoring the music to it. And then as soon as it got done, I would email him both a high definition stereo wave file of the cut that I did, as well as the scene they sent me, but now with the music mixed in, so you could see kind of the context of what I was thinking about. And and then we just did that for all the different scenes. And, after several weeks, the job was done. He had all his pieces together. He was able to piece it all together. Well, when I saw the footage for the opening sequence that he had put my music to, when I actually saw it on screen, I was like, oh, that's what he was thinking about. It ended up being like a complete, I was like, dang it. I mean, he really likes it. So, I mean, that's one of those things where it's like the director thinks it's good.
Yeah.
You're end of job, know? And I was like, man, I would have written something very different. I wrote something way too dark and dramatic for the way it was filmed and all that sort of stuff. I would have made something a lot lighter, a lot floatier, a lot more, instead of just using low cellos and throbbing electronic bass lines and all that sort of stuff. I would have done something a lot more, Hallmark Channel-ish. But he liked it, so I was like, all right, we're good then. And we reused a lot of the recurring themes that I introduced in that opening piece. We used them in other pieces because you associate a particular piece of music as it's almost a character, right? And it's hard to think about Luke Skywalker without the da 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 in the background, right? Because it's a character. I think that's really where in my opinion, that's where Avengers 2 really fell down, is that they didn't bring back Alan Silvestri to score Avengers 2: Age of Ultron. They brought in Brian Tyler and Danny Elfman, and completely different music.
Yeah,
and I mean, you'd hear hints of it here and there. It was like, this doesn't feel like the Avengers. And so they brought Alan Silvestri back for Infinity War, and it's like, okay, this feels like an Avengers movie now because the big, Avengers theme was there. Iron Man, same thing. They used 3 different composers for the 3 different Iron Man movies. There was no continuity.
It's a mess.
And it was a mess. As much as I really enjoyed the movies, I felt like I was watching a different Iron Man in some respects every time I saw the movie because the music was completely different. I hated the music in Iron Man 2. So in Bang Up Job, we kind of found myself trying to reuse themes in certain specific scenes or certain situations where there's kind of this common thing that goes back to
like a common plot device in the whole show.
It's either a common plot device. So I don't want to make it sound like it's cliche because it's not, right? Because if you think of music as a character, well, it's going to be a recurring character in the story, right? So it's okay to have reoccurring themes and motifs in your film because it becomes part of the character flow. And but going through the process and trying to figure out when do I use the theme, when do I come up with something new, how do I use the same theme but make it sound different because I don't want to just copy and paste either.
There's a really funny thing I've come across a few times on YouTube where this guy will take I don't know how he does it, if he just fakes, if he overdubs the human parts, but he takes out music out of movies. And you may have seen the Spider-Man clip a while back, Spider-Man like 2 or 3 with the original trilogy, where he's walking down the street being all cool guy. Have you seen that? You know what I'm talking about?
No, I've heard of people taking the music out, but
it's really cringy, but it's like hard to watch and listen to, but it's at the same time, you can't help but smile and laugh at it.
Spider-Man 3 was already cringy and hard to watch as it was.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you want to find this, just look up Mix Minus on YouTube, and he has clips from all these famous clips from famous movies where he takes out the music And all you hear is just like unpleasant human sounds and shoes on the ground and wind, and it's just so unnatural.
Right.
But
Yeah,
what it
but
would really be like.
that's
I love it.
that's part of the movie magic. I mean, I do remember watching the throne room scene in Star Wars without any music, and I'm like, yeah, that's awkward. That's a ceremony I'm glad I didn't have to go to.
Did you see Ready Player One, Brian?
Yes.
Yeah, did you notice the silent, no music scene as the opener of the car chase? When they're doing that opening car race through the city, and he's going backwards and this and that. Like, there's no music during that whole race scene.
I've noted. I don't remember that specifically because, to be honest with you, I really wasn't paying attention to the music, and because I only sat through it one time here at home, and I was really just kind of focusing on the visuals of it, so I really wasn't paying attention to the music, so I don't really recall that. But
I almost missed it. Yeah, I was too. Like, I love the eye candy of that movie, but I was like totally into the scene, and then I was like, wait a second. Where's like the 80s music? This is like,
well, I do remember.
80s.
I remember they played like most of Jump. I remember that. Like, wow, they paid a lot of money to Van Halen to play that much of the song.
Yeah, it's interesting when you can catch those times where they use silence and why, and the thought behind it is, it's always been intriguing to me because it is it's a musical piece. There is a kind of more modern, but there is a classical performance where it's kind of weird, but the concert actually had blank staffs. They weren't to play any actual music, and the composer's idea behind it, when someone questioned about it later, was like, why didn't they play any music? Is, well, the audience was the music. You hear sniffles and uncomfortable, wrestling in their seats and people like whispering to each other. The guy's like, that was the music. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of weird, but cool idea.
Yeah, that's, you get some of the really, it's like, where do you draw the line between avant-garde artistry and just laziness?
Is that really art?
Yeah. Is that... Did you just wake up and you just say, I got nothing? Hey, I'll do that.
I forgot to write a score for the past 2 years. I'm going to be eccentric.
And sleep in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So when you're in this process of, interpreting really the emotions that you see in the video when you have it, and the notes in the script, when you're kind of compiling all this together, which seems like a really big creative brain process, do you get writer's block? And what do you do when you hit that?
I get writer's block all the time. And I think and believe it or not, I think that's actually normal. Even Hans Zimmer, I was lucky enough to...
What?
I know, right? But I was lucky enough to get in on one of those master classes with Hans Zimmer.
Ooh, I saw those. Those
yeah,
cool.
it was that. Surprisingly, he didn't actually teach us anything about how to write music, but he taught us a lot about music, right?
Yeah.
It was a fantastic series. And, he talked to us about getting writer's block. And he's like, that happens to him almost every time he sits down in a movie. He's like, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, you're Hans Zimmer.
And then you hear a blah. And
I know. Suddenly you hear the 12 French horns that he used in Dark Knight, come through. And all right. Wow. Wish I had that kind of writer's block, but yeah, writer's block is something that happens on a pretty regular basis. And I've actually gotten to the point where I'm actually not really that afraid of it. I mean, it still makes me a little nervous, but I'm not as terrified of it as I used to be, cause I'm not one of those really weird, super right brain creative types. Right.
Yeah.
All the personality tests I've taken has put me pretty much dead center. So I'm not really extreme one way or the other, which in some ways is kind of nice, and other ways it's really boring. One of the things that I'll do, or one of the many things that I'll do if I've got writer's block, number one, what really helps me is pressure. And I hate saying that because I feel like I'm going to bring more of it down on me by calling it out. But if I've got a timeline on me, that for some odd reason, that just makes me step up. So when I've got actual footage in front of me, there's scenes that might escape me for a little bit. But for the most part, once I see something with my eyes, then I can kind of get into that, figuring out what the emotions are and what's the beat of the scene, that kind of stuff. That's just kind of a process thing I go through every time, doing the emotion map, or the emotion timeline, figuring out the tone. And then because I've spent the last several years studying the relationship between certain instruments and emotions. Once I have my emotion mapped down, I can kind of start figuring out what kind of instrumentation is going to work for that. And that
cool.
Going through that process generally kickstarts the creative engine.
Yeah. I've always imagined that's like one of the good traits of a successful composer is when they are given an emotion or they see a scene and there's no music to it yet, is like they'll know, like, or even have options. Well, a piccolo doing this tempo and this technique will be great for this scene, or this type of cello with a horn over here. Like they can just imagine things that'll fit.
Right. And I'll be honest with you, I'm probably going to spend the rest of my life learning that stuff.
Yeah. Well, you never reach it and you just rock and roll.
Right. I mean, even John Williams has said that he's still figuring stuff out about how the orchestra works. And I'm like, well, there's a pick me up.
I'll never learn anything.
I'll never learn anything now. If John Williams, arguably the best composer of our lifetime, and he can't figure out, but it's really more of a journey of you're always discovering new nuances for instruments. I mean, that's why so many people use an orchestra, is because an orchestra has the broadest emotional palette, right?
Yeah.
Now there's some things it can't, you can't do rock with an orchestra. You can bring an orchestra into rock, right? but you take the orchestra out of rock, you still have rock, right? So, or dubstep. You can bring the orchestra into dubstep if you want. I would
love to hear that.
But if you take the orchestra, it's like, hey, we just figured out a new.
I want to see like a full-on concert of Skrillex covers done by a true classical orchestra. That would be amazing.
It'd probably be somewhat impossible. Can you imagine trying, those poor cellists trying to figure out how to do a wobble?
They'll have wah pedals attached.
Yeah, it's gonna. Yeah, that might not work quite as well as people might think it would. So
maybe not be entertaining.
Right. It's worth a try, right? I mean,
lots of staccato.
If Metallica can play with an orchestra, Skrillex can play with an orchestra. It's all good. Once I figure out that emotional map, that's usually enough to kickstart some ideas. Another place I go to actually is when I go out shopping or browsing, because I typically don't have actual money to spend, but I'll go browsing for new virtual instruments out there. And a lot of times they'll have demo tracks. And there's some really interesting stuff that you might find buried in some of those demo tracks that just kind of makes some sounds or does things in a melody that you never really thought of before. And sometimes that is just enough to kickstart an idea. But more often than not, it's the emotion map that usually is the trigger.
So who are some musical influences to you?
There's the obvious John Williams and Hans Zimmer. I mean, we've been talking about those guys. Obviously, those guys are genre-defining guys. I mean, it's hard to be in this business of composing without having those two guys in particular be in your catalog. But I pull from all over. Even in the bands that I've been in, I get teased by my band members about pulling in things from out of left field to put into different genres. So I don't listen to a ton of eclectic music. It's not like I'm into every style of music and every underground indie band ever out there. I actually don't like most indie music. I think it's poorly produced, or it sounds like a car commercial that's in love with the environment, and I just hate that stuff. So my influences are actually all pretty mainstream. In the class, I've really learned a lot from listening to in the classical music. The early 20th century composers like Sibelius and Bartók, and those two guys in particular, those guys really have helped me kind of figure out how orchestral music works. I mean, their stuff is publicly available, so I have their scores. In fact, I'm looking at them right now, so I can actually look at, how did they orchestrate the violins and the brass and the woodwinds and the percussion, and how did it, because you listen to John Williams and I hear a lot of those two guys in particular, a lot of Holst as well, and John Williams music. So it's always cool to kind of see, well, what influenced the guys that are my primary influencers? Go back to the source, right? So Sibelius and Bartók and Holst, I think, are the three probably biggest classical influences on me, maybe a little bit of Beethoven. Looking at modern guys, there's a guy, Brett something or other. I can't remember his last name, but he goes by the stage name or the artist name of Blue Stolly.
Yeah.
And he's I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's kind of an electronic rock dude, one man act.
Cool.
He was made big by a guy named Cell Dweller, Clayton something or other.
Oh yeah, Cell Dweller.
Yeah,
Cell Dweller recently on Amazon Music.
Right, with Fixed Records, and Cell Dweller. It was like he's cool and he's got a couple of really good songs, but most of his stuff is just I don't like it. But I saw him in live, and he had another guy that was helping him out, and that was Blue Stolly. So I was like, oh, check this guy's out. Check this guy's music. And his music, for some odd reason, even though he writes like a lot of trailer music, he's only got like a couple of solo albums out. The way he writes, the way he combines heavy rock elements with electronic elements and some dubstep elements, and the way he just puts it all together just really resonates with me in a lot of ways. So he's kind of a primary influencer. But then you got guys like Lenny Kravitz, U2, Michael W. Smith, and Elton John. Those two guys in particular basically defined how I learned how to play a piano. I mean, 9 times out of 10, when somebody hears me play, it's either they ask me if they're Christians, they ask me if I, listen to Michael W. Smith. If they're not Christians, they ask me if I listen to Elton John, because those two guys sound a lot alike. Nice. And that's kind of where I get kind of some of that sort of stuff. But Lenny Kravitz was a big guitar influence on me. Some of the funky, I mean, when I pick up a guitar and I just kind of play a lick, I kind of sound like Stevie Wonder playing guitar. It's just kind of where I go.
Your go-to sound.
That's just kind of where I go. But then suddenly I'm Fireflight in there as well.
Nice.
That's kind of my more modern influences. But there's other composers that I'll listen to that affect. James Newton Howard, I think, is probably my favorite melodic composer. Hans Zimmer, I mean, he's awesome. Don't get me wrong. And John Williams is incredible. And John Williams actually is a jazz guy, which blew my mind. He was a jazz pianist at Juilliard Conservatory, and just stumbled into doing it. But I've been dissecting his scores now for the past 2-3 years, and it's all jazz chords. But but his arrangements and his orchestration is so brilliant, it doesn't sound like jazz. But his chord structures and the way he actually crafts all those pieces together, it's all jazz chord structures. The way, particularly when he does, he really did this in episode 4, his first movie, A New Hope. You hear a lot of the muted horns.
Yeah.
And that was all the way that those instruments were playing. Those were all jazz articulations, not classical.
So I'm sure he thoroughly enjoyed writing that space jazz song for the Cantina.
There's a reason why he's still composing at 90 years old. It's because he really digs doing this.
Yeah.
But James Newton Howard is a big influence for modern. I mentioned this guy before, Ramin Djawadi. He did Clash of the Titans, one of my favorite scores. He did the first Iron Man movie. So he's the guy that does Game of Thrones and Westworld on HBO. Cool. He did Person of Interest. So he actually came from the TV world.
Yeah.
Those two guys, Rupert Gregson Williams, actually both the Gregson Williams brothers, both Rupert and Harry Gregson Williams. I'll listen to almost anything those two guys write. Harry Gregson Williams did the Narnia trilogy. Excellent music. Rupert Gregson Williams did A Winter's Tale and Wonder Woman most recently. And so they're not super original. Yeah. But in this business, being original, while good and laudable, is not always right. Yeah. Because it always goes back to telling the director's story, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not always in the business of trying to find something that no one's ever heard before, because the stories that I've been involved with so far haven't demanded that kind of attention. So having these guys kind of in my back pocket, really allows me to kind of not have to worry about reinventing yet another wheel.
Yeah.
It's like, I know it works for this sort of stuff. I mean, it's going to be original in that it came out of my head. It's going to be an arrangement and a tune that you haven't heard this particular piece of music before, but I'm not having to go out and do the Hans Zimmer thing of invent new instruments.
Well, in case it wasn't obvious for the listeners listening to this episode, the intro and outro music are, of course, made by our very own Brian Christopherson. So thank you for letting us hear a little bit of your awesome music. This is kind of one of our last things I wanted to bring up is what is some of the hardware and software that you use regularly to make your stuff?
All right, now comes the nerd part of the show, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's what it's all about here. So, all right, so the cornerstone of everything that I do, I was lucky enough to acquire an IBM, a full-blown IBM dual Xeon server. So it's 12 physical cores. It's got 72 gigs of memory.
Goodness.
I mean, the server's 5 years old, but it would still, if I was to just replace it with its straight up equivalent, not upgrading anything, just getting a new version of the same thing, same clock speed, same cores, same memory, just at the current motherboard level, it would cost me about $15,000.
Wow.
So when I'm running a full virtual orchestra, got 24 in Windows, shows 24 cores. And when I'm running a full orchestra, they're all pegged at about 70%.
Man, you thought about doing a cryptocurrency mining on that thing?
I don't have time to get into that. Yeah. The answer is no, because there's guys that have servers that are millions of times more powerful than I am working on that already. I'm not going to find anything. I got better things to do with my time. But that's kind of the cornerstone of what it makes. If it wasn't for that, for me acquiring that server, I actually would have never gotten into this business. I wouldn't have been able to. Just because most people, I mean, you go and most professional composers usually have 3 or 4 of these. And because it takes that much horsepower to run all of these virtual synthesizers and virtual instruments all at the same time and have them respond, within, 10, 12 millisecond response times on everything. Because when I'm playing a keyboard, I mean, that sound's got a trigger in real time.
Yeah.
So it just requires an immense amount of computing power. So that's kind of the core of the studio. My main DAW is Cubase. Right now I'm running Cubase Pro 9.5, which is the latest version.
For those listening that are like, what did he just say? A DAW, DAW is digital audio workstation.
Yes.
FYI.
Yeah, DAW is not duh. I'm not saying anything weird there. It is an industry accepted acronym.
Yes.
So Cubase is generally where I do most of my work, and that it just has excellent editing capabilities, particularly for MIDI. It's what all the big composers, I wouldn't say all of them, but the vast majority of composers use this already. So if I'm watching a video from Hans Zimmer or James Newton Howard or Junkie XL or whoever it is, they're using the same software I am. And so it makes it eliminates that learning curve. Because, one of my biggest goals with technology is to actually use it. I know that sounds really rudimentary. I don't want to spend my time learning how to use something. I want to spend my time actually using it, right? Yeah. So, I started using Cubase about the time that I started working on my very first project for the Christian film director Leroy. We were doing a film called No Way Out. The end, I was able to get a little bit more orchestral, and I was just learning how to write for an orchestra, so it sounds kind of amateur. I mean, it was the perfect movie for me to kind of be experimental on. Not experimental in like exploring new sounds, but experimental in, I've never done this before, so I'm going to do a lot of crappy stuff here. It was the perfect movie for that. It never got released. It was actually my first credit on IMDb.com, ironically enough, though. Cool. It never got released, which is fine.
Fine by me.
It's absolutely fine by me.
It's one of those first 10,000 hours kind of thing.
Exactly. So that's where I learned how to actually, fly a video track into Cubase. I mean, at that point in time, I was actually using Cakewalk Sonar up until then, because that's what we'd done all our band stuff in.
Cakewalk.
Yeah. And, but I realized pretty quickly that it was just not designed for composing. So I think it was Hans Zimmer said something in a YouTube video that said, hey, I use Cubase, blah, 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 blah. So I was like, all right, I'll give it a shot. And then I discovered its tempo mapping capabilities, and that sold me. So I was really able to synchronize where a measure would start to a specific frame. And I could drag and drop my tempo. So I could create an actual tempo map in Cubase before I started any kind of writing. Then I could start inserting really detailed markers throughout. So I actually could do that whole emotion. That's kind of where I started learning how to do kind of the mapping out the emotions and the tones and all that sort of stuff before I actually started writing anything, because I could actually put that into Cubase. So I had that as marker tracks right there in front of me that I could then start going in and sequencing certain things, or start play deals, or start inserting different time signatures in. All that's, I mean, that whole movie ended up being in 4/4, but
yeah, that sounds fun.
Yeah,
the tracking and the marking and stuff.
Yeah, so Cubase was really kind of the DAW of choice. My secondary software that I would use is Sibelius as a notation program.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm doing a more orchestral score, I'll start with with a pencil and paper. That's actually my initial technology.
Yeah.
Because I can sit down with a piece of music manuscript and start lining out kind of how I want the score to go.
Yeah.
That sort of deal. But I'll use Sibelius. I actually am able to link Sibelius via Rewire to
sweet.
To Cubase. So Sibelius will actually follow that tempo map in Cubase.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got virtual MIDI ports going between a particular, so like Violin 1 actually maps to the Violin 1 track.
Wow.
In Cubase. So that way I can actually do the orchestral stuff in Sibelius and make it look like actual sheet music.
Yeah.
But all the extra synthy, guitar stuff, drum beats, all that sort of stuff, I can keep that in Cubase.
Very cool.
So nice.
I love Rewire. I used to make music with Reason and Ableton, and you could do the same thing. We're sending audio to and from and MIDI, and that was just like, I loved it. And they would play in sync with each other, which was like amazing.
Yeah, I don't ever use the actual audio piece of it, even though technically the tempo track actually uses an audio channel, but Sibelius is kind of set up to follow a tempo track that's coming in over Rewire. But outside of that, I don't use any audio, because I got to keep my latency on my audio interfaces down as much as possible. So I guess leading into the next really hugely important piece of the setup is my audio interfaces.
Yeah.
Or my main interface that I use is actually a PCI Express card from RME. It's a Hammer's Fall something or other. I can't remember I can't believe I forgot the name of that. Here I am in the podcast, and I'm supposed to be the guy that intimately knows every single molecule of what I have in this studio. I can't remember the stupid name of my most important audio card, but it's an RME card. It's a PCI Express card, because that gives me absolute lowest latency. I was trying for a lot of years. I was doing USB and FireWire interfaces, and FireWire kind of went out the door, and I'm on a PC-based system, obviously, so Thunderbolt was never really an option for me. USB is fine for like just recording band stuff. If I'm just trying to hook up a guitar into an audio interface, USB is great for that sort of stuff. And Focusrite makes really solid drivers, good preamps. When it comes down to just playing back all these virtual instruments, it just could not keep up. I ended up with all sorts of latency problems, clicks and pops. It would cut out, buffer out. I have to change buffer settings to just absolutely ridiculous level. So even though I got rid of the pops, now I press a key on my keyboard. I got to wait 3 seconds for the sound to go. That's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I ended up going with this card, and it only accepts ADAT light pipe. So I'm
It's optical signal?
Yeah, it's optical. So it's these fiber optic cables. So I ended up kind of getting the best of both worlds, where I could use my existing Focusrite interfaces, but they've got ADAT out. So I can actually connect it to, I don't even have to use the USB. The only time I use the USB is if I actually need to go in and change a setting in it. But there's no audio that gets passed over USB. It's done over this light pipe. So my latencies come way back down, which made the whole system far more responsive. And it was a lot of money. I mean, it was $1,000 just for that one card. So
wow,
man,
I've got about $2,000 in audio interfaces all told. That makes running the orchestras possible. That's what, if I call up another virtual instrument or a synthesizer of some sort on the computer, I can hit a key on my keyboard and, it instantly sounds. So it's actually playable.
Yeah.
So those are the interfaces. I've got a Nectar Panorama P1 controller. So when you're programming, violins and these different instruments, you want to have a lot of cello. So one of the things I learned, when I was learning about orchestration is, fortissimo and pianissimo and all these different dynamics levels and different articulations and ways that you can play these instruments.
Yeah.
being able to in real time control the expression and the volume of an instrument so that you create those dynamic changes that makes the music come alive is really important. So I've actually got a little digital mixer, and the faders on the mixer are mapped to different MIDI controller channels that control expression, modulation, portamento, vibrato,
Sweet.
volume, all these different kind of parameters. So as I play things on the keyboards or I listen to them, a playback coming in from Sibelius, I can kind of just in real time adjust what the
automate them yourself.
Right, I can automate them. So a lot of times when I'm in Sibelius, I'll kind of already have a I'll put in the dynamic markers. I'll put in P or a double F or something like that on certain notes, and that'll map to a particular modulation or expression level. So a lot of the basic dynamics are already there. But nobody, when you listen to a human being actually play an instrument, they don't play at a computer perfect level. It wavers a little bit, right? And it's not a perfect slope downwards when they fade out. It's a little erratic. I'll take the kind of the automated parts as kind of that's my rough draft of it, but then I'll go in with the fader, create the actual moment, second by second movement of that particular controller. And it just makes a much more lifelike experience.
Wow. Cool. Well, Brian, thank you so much for kind of just opening up the behind the scenes of how this whole thing works.
My pleasure.
Really interesting.
It's been fun to talk to somebody to some folks who actually might be interested in hearing about this. It's been an interesting journey.
Oh yeah. I think all the cinephiles will appreciate this episode. Well, again, Brian, thanks for joining us. We hope to have you back sometime in the future for something
absolutely.
fun and nerdy.
Anytime.
Maybe a movie review or maybe a soundtrack review of a movie or something cool like that.
If you allow me to do a shameless plug, if you want to listen to
yes. Where can we find and listen to you?
You can't have a podcast without doing a shameless plug, right?
Can't blow our mind and then be like, well, goodbye.
See ya. We'll never find you again, but bye.
I was making this up as I went. I don't really exist.
I pretty much am.
Right?
Where can we find you online?
So I've got social media is not my strong point, and actually I think once we actually get into the post-production stage of Recreation, I think we're going to have a lot more things happening online. I do have a Facebook page. It's LPM Film Music. Or you just type in Legend Point Media. Hopefully that'll take you to it. So that's my Facebook page. And as soon as we get really going on Recreation, you're going to see a lot more activity coming at you from there. If you want to check out my some of the clips of music that I've done before for either previous film or TV projects, as well as some of my own stuff, you can go to SoundCloud.com, search for Brian Christopherson, and it will come up. I do also have LegendPointMedia.com is a website. It's currently somewhat under construction, but it does have an active contact page and some clips also that you can listen to if in case any of you directors or producers out there. Like I said earlier, I have a price. I can be bought. I am available.
The Keytar package.
The Keytar package is a little spendy, but
platinum.
We'll that is definitely that's a plug-in.
All right. Well, this has been a fun episode. Thanks, Brian, for coming on. And
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you guys for listening to the Visionary Variety podcast. As always, we'd love to hear back from you guys. You can write us at tvvpodcast@gmail.com or comment on any of our social media posts. And you can find us pretty much on all our platform and social media outlets if you just Google the Visionary Variety podcast. You'll find us all over the place. And we would love a good comment and review on iTunes to boost our, popularity there. Let us know. Let all your friends, geeky and otherwise, know about our podcast and share our posts. That would be much appreciated because we're still a new and small podcast, and anything you do helps so much. All right. Well, thanks for listening and have a great week. Very cool. That's awesome.
That's 2 minutes.
Is that the 2-minute warning?
Okay, as you go.
2 minutes.
Bye-bye. Oh my gosh, he just pokes his head in here. Azzy, go play. Go on.
2 minutes.
All right.